Hello and welcome to the 2022 Ontario Election Preview Show, sponsored by the Ontario Real Estate Association. I'm Tim Hudak, CEO of the Ontario Real Estate Association. Thrilled to be co-hosting here with Brian Santos, our talented, charming, very successful leader from Kitchener-Waterloo, who happens to be our chair of the Government Relations Committee at OREA. This is part of what we've done as the Ontario Realtor Party Conference over the years, the best public affairs conference anywhere in Canada. We look forward to getting back in person next year. Had to do a video this year. The timing's pretty good though. Only a few months until Election Day, June 2nd. So you are going to have the best insight from the leaders and those that follow them in the media of what's going to happen between now and Election Day and who's going to cross the finish line first. Brian Santos, what's your take on the exciting day ahead of us as part of this two-day series?
That's right, Tim. At OREA, our motto is if real estate's your profession, then politics should be your business. What happens at Queen's Park has a direct impact on both the business of real estate and whether or not Ontarians can afford the dream of home ownership. We saw this firsthand last year when the government finally brought those types of changes into effect. At long last, personal real estate corporations, PRECs, and we saw several pieces of pro-home ownership legislation, like the More Homes, More Choice Act. So we put together this two-part series to give our members insider knowledge you won't get anywhere else on the upcoming Ontario election and how it will impact real estate. In just a few short minutes, you're going to hear an exclusive polling presentation from the CEO of Abacus Data, David Coletto. David is going to provide some insight into where all four of the political parties are sitting in terms of public support.
Oh, I'm looking forward to that. Fresh numbers, hot out of the field. And right after that, folks, I get to interview Ontario Liberal leader Stephen Del Duca. I got to ask the leader of the Liberal Party, what's his plan when it comes to the housing affordability in our province? And what would his priorities be if elected as leader? Does he have the chops to take on the big job? Well, you decide and check that out next. And then after that, I get to interview the Queen's Park Press Gallery. So the best and brightest media observers, they'll peel back the curtain to tell you what's happening behind the scenes, and then also get them to make a prediction. Who's going to finish first come Election Day? And then Brian Santos, the capper, the premier of the province himself, Doug Ford, back for the fourth straight year. What's it like to manage through this pandemic? What's his plan when it comes to bringing home affordability closer for Ontario families? And how does he plan to campaign come June the 2nd? That is one action-packed show as we start out. So folks, sharpen those pencils, go warm up that coffee, and get ready for an awesome program. Back to you, Brian Santos, to introduce our first guest.
Well, thanks, Tim. With voting day happening on June 2nd, the Ontario election is only 112 days away. This is a very important election for realtors across Ontario because whoever wins the June election will be making critical decisions on issues that impact your business. From new rules under TRESA to solving the home affordability crisis, the next government will have a heavy focus on issues impacting realtors. To help us unpack where the four political parties stand today and what to expect over the next few months, I'm pleased to welcome David Coletto to the program. David is the CEO of Abacus Research, one of Canada's most trusted market research organizations. David has done many projects with realtor associations, and his team at Abacus are constantly taking the pulse of Ontarians on a wide range of subjects, including politics. David, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me, Brian. Great to be here. How you doing?
Very well, thank you. David, I know that you've come here today with a fresh set of polling that you've just taken out on the field. So let's jump right to it. Can your polling help shed some light into what issues are top of mind for voters and who we think is best positioned to win the 2022 Ontario election campaign?
We've been looking at how Ontarians are feeling about their political choices, and we just completed a survey for OREA that looked at housing and the issue of housing as it pertains to this upcoming election. So let me get right into the data. I think the three big takeaways from the research in my presentation today are, first, the Progressive Conservatives and Doug Ford have an advantage now in terms of vote intention and how people feel about Mr. Ford versus his rivals. But I think given how still much time we have left, there are too many variables at play for us to really know how this provincial election is going to end. I think it could be very competitive. Now, housing affordability is a top issue in the province. I'm going to show you data that undeniably confirms this, as concerns about housing and the cost of living become front and center to the public of all parts of the province and across all demographics. And I think there's a clear opportunity for the political parties as they develop their policies, as they connect with voters headed into this campaign, to show that they care about this issue and to differentiate themselves from one another. So let's look at the data. Right now, when we ask Ontarians, do you want a change in government? 50% say they definitely want a change in government. Now, that might seem like a really high number, but keep in mind that back in 2018, when Kathleen Wynne was running for re-election, over 60% definitely wanted a change in government. And in the recent federal election, a similar number, 50%, wanted to see a change at the federal level. So this is not at the level yet that is deeply troubling for the Progressive Conservatives, but there's no doubt a sense of desire to see this government defeated. There's lots of people who would rather not have Doug Ford as premier, but as when we ask people how they would vote, we continue to see the Progressive Conservatives in a position of strength. 37% say they would vote PC, 28% Liberal, and the NDP just behind the Liberals at 25%. Now, compared to the last election, the PCs are down slightly, the Liberals are up substantially, and the NDP are down. And so with the kind of division on the center left of the spectrum, the PCs could go up the middle and would certainly win the most seats and may even win a majority government in this scenario. Now, when we look at the results across the province, what's important to note is the Progressive Conservative vote share is fairly consistent, whether we're looking at Toronto, the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area, East, West, or North. Where we see some differences is that the Liberals are stronger in and around Toronto, the New Democrats more competitive with the Liberals outside of that region. And so these regional breaks will become really important because they'll ultimately determine the seat makeup of the legislature and ultimately who will get to form government and whether it's a majority or minority. Now, one of the big factors that I continually see in Ontario is the difference between how younger and older voters say they're going to vote, right? If you look at this chart, among those under the age of 45, for example, the Progressive Conservatives are far less popular. Only about 1 out of 5 of those under 30 say they would vote PC, and the NDP and the Liberals do much better among this group. But if you go to older cohorts, almost about half exactly of those over 60 say they would vote PC. We know that those voters are more likely to turn out and vote on election day, regardless of the situation. That bodes well for the Progressive Conservatives. So if this kind of vote split continues by age, this remains a strength for the Progressive Conservatives and something that the Liberals and the New Democrats are going to need to figure out. Now, among those who rank housing affordability, and we'll get more into that in a moment, as a top issue, here's how their vote breaks out. You can see, again, the Progressive Conservatives still have a lead, although that lead is much smaller among this group. And I'll tell you more about who this group is in a moment. They have a 4-point lead over the New Democrats, with the Liberals not that far behind. So all intents and purposes, it's a pretty close race among the 3 main parties, among those who care most about housing affordability as a top issue. Now, when we ask people how much they know about the party leaders, why ask this question? Well, we have a new Liberal leader in Mr. Del Duca. Only 38% of Ontarians say they know him either very well or pretty well. So he's largely unknown to the majority of the population. For Doug Ford, on the other end, you can see 82% have a good sense of who he is. That makes sense. He's been premier for almost 4 years. He's well known in the province. There's not a lot that people don't know about him. Their impressions are pretty solid. But the interesting number is Ms. Horwath, the New Democrat leader and the opposition leader, right? She's been leader of the NDP for 13 years, and yet only 60%. And I say only because I think after the career she's had in Ontario politics, you'd think you'd have more people aware of her. I think she's struggled to get attention and get known. And so, again, one of the variables in this campaign will likely be the fact that the 2 main opponents, the 2 main alternatives to Mr. Ford, are not well known. And so they can still be defined by themselves and by their opponents. Now, when we ask people, how do they feel about the leaders? Do they have a positive or negative view? One of the things to note among these results is that none of these leaders are overly positive and popular, right? Ms. Horwath and Mr. Ford have about equal numbers saying they have a positive view. Mr. Del Duca only has 20% saying they have a positive view of him. And in the case of Mr. Ford, his negatives are pretty high, just under half have a negative view of him, but they're not as high as they used to be. If you go back before the pandemic, we had negatives for Mr. Ford in the 60s. So the pandemic has softened opposition to him. I think more people have warmed to the way that he's handled this pandemic and the way he's communicated. But nonetheless, the story is none of these leaders are lighting things on fire, which again adds more uncertainty to how people might react to them when they see them up close during an election campaign. Now, issues obviously matter. And this pandemic has been like a roller coaster for people living in the province, opening and closing, and anxiety around different waves throughout. But when we ask people to rank the issues that they want the provincial government to focus most on, and we give them a long list and say, pick 3, here is the list of issues. So the rising cost of living, the pandemic still is in focus when we did this research, improving the healthcare system, long-term care for seniors, and making housing more affordable round out the top 5. 68% of adults in the province put making housing more affordable as one of their top 3 issues. And if you mix that in with the rising cost of living, broader questions around affordability, I think are going to be front and center along with, and we'll see where this pandemic is in June. I don't think the affordability crisis is going anywhere soon. Hopefully, this pandemic will be. Now, I'll also point out at the bottom of this screen that we asked specifically about wanting to see more homes built. Not a top issue, but still 4 out of 10 adults said they believe that building more homes should be a top issue, top focus for the provincial government going forward. That's an indicator of just how concerned people are about housing. Now, some people will say, well, this is an issue that really only matters in the Greater Toronto area, or maybe in Ottawa as well, in the larger cities. But what we see, what's changed over the last number of years is that the issue of housing affordability extends to every part of the province, whether you're in the north, in the south, in the east, or the west, or in Toronto, around 70%, a little less in Eastern Ontario, 61, but nonetheless, clear majorities in every part of this province say housing affordability is a top issue. And that's a signal that this issue no longer is concentrated in one part of the province. In fact, those living in southwestern Ontario and in the north are just as likely as those living in Toronto to say this is a top issue. Now, as you might expect, those who are aspiring to maybe buy a home, those who are dealing with maybe lower incomes because they're younger, are more likely to say this is a top issue. Among those under 30, for example, 8 in 10 put it in their top 3 issues. But even those who are older and may not really be, maybe they're homeowners, maybe they don't aspire to buy a home anymore, 6 in 10 of those older cohort care about this issue and think it should be important, which is again an indicator that it crosses generation, it crosses age cohort. Lastly, the politics of this issue. Now, New Democrat supporters, those who support the Liberals, are more likely to say this is a top issue, but only slightly. Even half of progressive conservative voters in 2018 said that this issue should be a top issue. So there is an audience across the political spectrum, across the province, across demographics for a conversation about housing affordability and what this government can do, whatever the government looks like going forward, to solve this issue. So when we dig a bit deeper then, and we say, okay, housing's a top issue, what does that mean? Well, a few things are worth noting. First of all, and this is a tracking study, we've been tracking these attitudes for OREA now for the past year. And as of right now, 3 in 4 Ontarians believe it has become more difficult to buy a home in the past year. And as they look forward over the next 12 months, 65% believe it's going to get harder, or that housing prices are going to continue to rise. And so this dual view that it's been hard for the last 12 months and that few believe there's going to be any relief in the system is an indicator that they're looking for solutions, right? They don't think this problem is going to solve itself. Now, when we look at younger non-homeowners in particular, and we ask, how are you feeling about the prospect of buying a home? You've got some, about 1 out of 5, 1 out of 4, mind you, who say they're very optimistic or pretty optimistic about their prospects. They typically come from higher income households, make more money themselves, maybe are a little bit older. But what I think is important is the large number of young, aspiring homeowners who say, I'm getting pessimistic, or I've even given up. buying a home. And we have to watch that number very carefully, because if that pessimistic group continues to rise, that's going to put even more pressure on policymakers, on politicians, on others, and other stakeholders to figure out how to solve this problem. And we don't want that dream of homeownership is still alive and well in this province, even among those who are becoming frustrated and maybe disillusioned by the market. They're still seeking solutions, and they're very watching carefully the realistic nature of those solutions and what they mean. Now, one of the questions that I think the incumbent government, Mr. Ford and his government, need to think about is whether people believe what they have done over the last 4 years has improved the situation. And what we find is that almost half feel that the decisions by the provincial government have made it more difficult to buy a home. Now, I live in the world of perception, right? Whether or not that's true, whether or not the government believes that's true is not important. It's what the public thinks. And very few think the government has actually made things better or made it easier for people to buy a home, including many of its own supporters. And so there's risk here that, Mr. Ford and the alternatives, Mr. Del Duca and Ms. Horvath, they need to think about the perceptions that the public have. The last point I will make is when we think of this as a political issue, and we ask respondents, would you be more or less likely, or not more or less likely, it's not going to affect your vote, if a political party made housing affordability a central part of its platform? Now, 1 in 4 Ontarians, right? 10 people walk down the street, 2.5 of them, if you want to cut them up in that way, would say I would be much more likely, not just more likely, much more likely to vote for that party if they made it central to their campaign. And that is the key question, right? Do you have a set of policies that appeal to voters, that voters say, yes, that's going to help solve the solution, is step one. But I believe one of the reasons why politicians of all stripes across this country haven't connected on this issue is that we don't hear enough about it, right? We don't believe that you're putting it as a priority. And our data clearly backs that up, that whether you're talking about the government and the progressive conservatives, or you're talking about the opposition parties, no one really feels that any of the leaders care deeply about this issue and are really committed to solving it. So there's an opportunity in this data to move forward. So as I said, the current state of the race remains one in which the PCs have an advantage, but it's not a lock, and they can't coast into a re-election. It's going to be a competitive, tough-fought campaign. Mr. Ford has his liabilities. He's improved them slightly over the last 2 years, but he's still not safe for re-election. The opposition is divided, which means if there's a consolidation around either the New Democrats or the Liberals, that could spell trouble for Mr. Ford. And so how that all works out in the next few months is going to be the key political question. But there's no doubt in my mind, looking at this data and data that I've done both at the national and provincial level, that housing is not just a top issue today. It's been for a while, but it seems that as prices continue to go up, as interest rates start to go up, and people start to think about the ability for them to get this done, there's going to be more and more demand to want to hear from their candidates, from the leaders, from the parties, what they're going to do to solve this problem. Because ultimately, what our research shows is it not only affects people day to day in their own lives, but people look around and say, if we don't figure out how to make housing affordability or solve for the housing affordability crisis, it could have long-term impacts on the competitiveness of our province. And we all know somebody who's left the province because they couldn't find affordable housing. And so this is, I think, going to be one of the big issues going forward. Brian?
Thanks, David. That is some outstanding data and insight. As a follow-up, we saw housing emerge as an issue of great importance in last year's federal election campaign. Do you expect to see the cost of housing become one of the central issues in Ontario's provincial campaign as well?
Yeah, Brian, I think you saw what I call almost like an arms race at the federal level for all the parties putting out, quite a bit of detail and policy around housing. If any of the parties are doing any of their polling or they're consuming this, I think they're going to have to answer the question, what are you going to do about housing? It's so top of mind to people. It's so present. And it's not just young people who want to buy a home who are wondering, what are you going to do for me? It's also their parents, their grandparents, who want to see them be able to achieve that dream. So I suspect we're going to have a lot of conversations about this in the coming months and certainly during the campaign.
Excellent. David, two of the issues OREA has been fighting hard to advance at Queen's Park are lowering taxes for first-time homebuyers and ending unfair exclusionary zoning in big cities. So like in other words, making it easier to build duplexes and triplexes, call it gentle density, in areas that had only been zoned for single-family homes. What does your polling say about Ontarians' views on those solutions and maybe some others that are being considered here in Ontario?
Well, I think the first point is there's broad support for a range of tools that could be used. I think, given the public's perception and understanding of the problem, they're looking for solutions. And so whether it is, for example, doubling the tax credit for the land transfer tax rebate for first-time home buyers, we find broad support for that idea. 2/3 of Ontarians say they supported, very little opposition for that idea. So providing tax relief to first-time homeowners, given the environment, is seen as something that could at least get us partly of the way there. But your point about exclusionary zoning, I think this is an emerging issue. We still see that not everybody is aware of it, but as they become more aware of it, we find by almost a 3-to-1 margin, people say, yeah, this makes sense. We should be looking for creative solutions that expand the availability of housing and land for people, and this notion that we need to protect, certain interests and the NIMBYism that sometimes comes up is something that I think is going to find a lot of resistance, because people realize, in places like Toronto and the Greater Toronto area, we're running out of land, and so we need to be more creative with how we manage density. And I do think that that's an issue that's going to become more popular over time.
Last question. Based on the numbers you've seen, which of the 4 political parties in Ontario do you feel are best positioned to win on the housing affordability issue?
Well, here's the thing. When we asked Ontarians, there wasn't a clear winner who they thought would do best. The New Democrats have a slight advantage, but only slight, over the Progressive Conservatives, which tells me that, and we've seen this in the past, on this issue, there's no one leader. There's no one obvious choice. And so that signals to me there's an opportunity. There's an opportunity to not only stake a flag and say, I am for the dream of home ownership. I want more people to afford to buy a home. I want more people to afford the rent that they seek to live. Looking at the full ladder of ownership. And so I think, the fact that there's no clear winner on this issue, no one who owns it, creates more opportunities for these parties and for everyone involved in the sector to encourage the parties to develop policies, to ask them what they're going to do about it, and for us to raise the issue throughout this campaign, because I think voters want to hear answers and they're listening. And that means the stakes are pretty high.
Well, it's certainly shaping up to be an exciting few months as we lead up into this June election. So it's great to get these detailed numbers and get a better understanding of what's going on in the minds of voters and who they might be supporting in June. So David Coletto is the CEO of Abacus Research. David, thanks for being here with us today.
My pleasure, Ryan. Take care.
Up next, our popular Queen's Park media panel. They'll join us and give you the goods about provincial politics heading into the June election. We'll be right back after this.
There's so much news, there's so much media. Don't be scared to take the data and interpret it. That's what people need. They need the local expert. They need your eyes.
Unlike lead generation, you can't buy being a member of the community. You've got to invest time. And I think that people who do it really well have very little or no competition.
It's the relationship that has the value. It's not the transaction that has the value.
For realtors, probably the key takeaway here is that I'm not sure there are going to be as many people moving like 2 blocks to the left.
I think that's probably the future of the real estate industry, responding to disruption, but from a position of relative strength.
This is the Real Estate Edition podcast. Subscribe today.
Well, welcome back. We are now part of what is always one of our most popular segments during our conferences. That is the immediate pundit panel. And we've got the best of the best for you today to give a look behind the curtains at Queen's Park and a preview for what's going to happen come Election Day on June the 2nd. Joining us from the Toronto Star, the chief of the bureau, still despite his young age, I'll call him the dean of the press gallery at Queen's Park, Robert Benzie from CTV News, Colin DeMello, and Marika Walsh back again from the Globe and Mail. Thank you all for taking the time to join us at our conference.
Hey, everyone.
Happy to be here.
So we just had our pollster on earlier, and you've seen all the polls. Basically, they say anybody could win. Our pollster says that Doug Ford and the PCs emerging with a slight lead now, but it could be anybody's game. So, Robert Benzie, you have covered how many campaigns now?
A lot. Seven,
so
6, 7, 8, something.
So, making your prediction from here towards June the 2nd, who do you think is in the driver's seat?
I mean, obviously the premier is, if the Tories have a majority, if the election were held today, they would win, but it's not being held today. And I don't know if they'd win a minority or a majority, but they would have the most seats in the legislature if the vote were in February. But the vote is in June, and lots of things can happen between now and then. And I think if you're Doug Ford, you're hoping that Omicron is the last blast of COVID-19, and you can move forward and talk about rebuilding and the economy and all these other things. And if you're Stephen Del Duca and Andrea Horwath and Mike Schreiner, you're going to be saying the pandemic's not over and we have a lot of challenges ahead. And it's so events could take hold, as they often do, Tim, as you well know, that things can go sideways on a government pretty quickly.
And Marika Walsh, do you see this as a almost like the NCAA is a primary on the center left is going to be Andrea Horwath versus Stephen Del Duca to see who takes on Doug Ford and the Conservatives, or is it really a three-way race?
Well, I think what we saw in the last election in Ontario, Tim, and I think what we'll probably see today in the next one is that the left coalesces around one party and then that person takes on Doug Ford. And it just depends on when that happens, whether that happens before the official race, during the race. And if it doesn't happen, that really does give the upside to Ford because it's a split on the left. I think all of the leaders are contending with an extremely volatile mood in the electorate that leaves it very unpredictable, not just from the events that Benzie was talking about, but also just how people will be responding. I think the protests that we saw in Ottawa last week are a good example of an increasingly angry and frustrated electorate, and how that plays into these parties and how they respond to them, I think will really help to decide the election.
And Colin, where do you stand on that? I mean, is it Doug Ford versus one of the two? And if it is one of the two, who do you think has the edge, Stephen Del Duca or Andrea Horwath?
Well, I mean, coming into it right now, it has to be Andrea Horwath. I mean, she has 40 seats in the Ontario legislature. If she can't capitalize on that and really push the momentum forward, well, then, what has she been doing for the past 4 years? For Stephen Del Duca, I mean, is he really going to be able to shed himself of the scandals of the former Liberal government? He hasn't really shied away from associating himself as a former cabinet minister in the Wynne government, but he, also has to wear some of the baggage from that government as well. So I don't know if people are necessarily ready to forgive the former Wynne Liberals. So it could end up being a battle between the two before it ends up being Ford. But in the initial stages of the campaign, I think it's all going to be trained onto Doug Ford before, one of them starts to lose a little bit of support in the polls, and then they start to turn on each other. So I think it could actually happen during the campaign itself, where we start to see that, the movement coalesce behind one leader. And that's really going to be indicative when you see the support swing one way or the other.
Okay, Marika, I'm going to come back to you. I'm going to put you in the shoes of the Ontario Liberal campaign. You're the campaign manager. Colin said what's likely to happen. Both the Tories and the New Democrats will try to attach Del Duca to the previous Liberal government. What are the two things that you would accomplish or try to do between now and Election Day if you're running Stephen Del Duca's campaign?
Well, you'd hope that somebody would get to know who he is or what his name is, because I think that's his first challenge. I think the one really favorable, or the one wind pushing Del Duca and the Liberals forward, is the fact that the expectations for him are so low. He has not performed well. And so that means that it's easy for him to walk over the bar if he is able to do it. So with low expectations, with low seat count, it is very possible, given the strength of the Liberal brand in Ontario, that he could make an upset. He could surprise people. But certainly their fundraising challenges are an issue. as is his own personal popularity and brand, which, as I understand it, is well behind the Liberal brand in Ontario.
All right, Colin, new Democrat campaign manager. I put that hat on you. You're wearing the orange colors for a moment. What would you coach Andrew Horwath to do between now and June the 2nd?
Well, I think they really have to start tapping into the emotions of a lot of people, right? To Marika's point, people are angry out there. And I think the NDP is going to start focusing on the emotions that people are feeling, right? Look at the things that Doug Ford maybe took away from you. Look at the hardships that, his government has brought to Ontario from their perspective. And that's really what they're going to try to tap into to maybe give themselves a little bit of the edge. Because remember, for the first time in a long time, the NDP's issues, the issues that they've been talking about, from long-term care to, affordability, these are the top of mind issues for the Ontario electorate going into this election campaign. And so that's probably where they want to put a little bit more of the focus. And we've seen her do that. Sometimes, though, the NDP kind of has tunnel vision. They only focus on long-term care when everyone else might be focusing on the economy. So they have to start to broaden their horizons a little bit. But I think they're going to keep reminding everyone that, Stephen Del Duca is, one of the things the campaign manager had told us was they want to remind people of who Stephen Del Duca is, because they want to remind people of Kathleen Wynne and how unpopular that government is. So, they're going to keep bringing it up. The NDP, the PCs are going to keep bringing it up as well. So for Stephen Del Duca, I don't think he's ever going to, get rid of the albatross that is the former Liberal government.
Robert Benzie, Toronto Star. So Doug Ford came to victory in 2018 with a coalition that previous PC leaders, including the Hudak fella, failed to put together, right? To champion the little guy and all that. Does that coalition still exist, or what does a Doug Ford coalition for victory look like in 2022?
It looks a little different, I think, Tim, because a couple of things. First of all, he's not running against Kathleen Wynne. He's not running against a government that was in power for 15 years. And there isn't that fed up factor with the previous administration that you can exploit as much as you could in 2018. I do know that their own research shows that one of the problems that Ford has is he's not in it for you, he's not there for the little guy. That actually doesn't test well on that. Luckily for the Tories, that's not a huge voting issue. But if I were the Liberals or the New Democrats, I would be exploiting the fact that Mr. Ford is seen to be in the pocket of developers. Whether that's fair or unfair, I don't know. And I would push on those things, that he's not the fighter for the little guy, that is public image with the shovel out, getting people out of snowbanks and so on. That's the perception that his rivals have. And I think that it's something that I would exploit if I were them. If I were Doug Ford, I wouldn't be talking about I'm in it for you, the little guy, all that. I would be talking about, let's build together. Let's look at how Ontario did in the pandemic. We did better than Quebec. We did better than Manitoba. We did better than New York, and we did better than Michigan. Those are all our neighboring jurisdictions, and we fared better. We still had a bad pandemic, but guess what? It was bad everywhere. So if you're Doug Ford, what you want to be talking about is after the pandemic. So we're talking about building the Highway 413. We're talking about the bypass, the Bradford bypass, projects like that are sort of building and the future rather than looking back.
Marika, I heard you respond to Rob there. You saw an early Doug Ford as premier, who is very different than Doug Ford as premier during the pandemic. What do you think we're actually seeing in the campaign trail, one or the other, or a mixture of both?
I think we're probably going to see a mixture of both. I think what's interesting about this election campaign is that, yes, the last one was only 4 years ago. It was only 4 years since Kathleen Wynne was the premier, but so much has changed and it feels like a lifetime ago. And so how much will he be held to account, for example, for the promises he made in 2018, which didn't come to pass in part because of the pandemic? And how much hay can he still make off of Kathleen Wynne and off of opposition to her government in this new election? If you look at Justin Trudeau's campaigns, he still makes hay off of Stephen Harper regularly and has in the last two elections that led to a minority. So it's clearly not impossible to do, but I think he has to be aware of how much has changed, and the mood of the electorate has also changed that much more.
Last question for you, Colin, on sort of the horse race, and I want to get into the pandemic and housing as a major issue. The opposition leader of the official opposition, Andrew Horwath, that's usually auditioning. Do you have the chops to become premier of the province? You've known Andrew Horwath for a long time, in person, very warm, great sense of humor. How is she coming across, and how is she connecting with the average voter today? Are they seeing the real Andrea Horwath?
Well, I mean, I don't know if a lot of us have been seeing really the real Andrea Horwath. I mean, because ultimately she's been spending the last kind of 4 years. It seems like she's on a negative bend as opposed to kind of a positive one, right? And that's ultimately what people might want to see, right? They don't necessarily want to see. If you take a look at Doug Ford in the 2018 election campaign, he talked about how, you know, Ontario was just this scorched earth place that nobody wanted to come to. Businesses were leaving, and that he was going to be the savior. You don't really see that with Andrea Horwath, because all she's been doing is kind of being very critical, very negative on the premier. And I think that seems to be turning a lot of people off. You've seen it in the polls over the last number of weeks, right? Or last number of months, especially in April, when the government had brought in those unpopular pandemic policies to close playgrounds and give police new powers. The electorate, they didn't go to the NDP. They went to the Ontario Liberals, because Del Duca's been trying to position himself as this pragmatist who gives Doug Ford some kudos and tries to offer some productive ideas. What we see from the NDP is a lot of negativity, and you know that doesn't necessarily bode well when you talk to the average voter, who they want to hear a bit of positivity in politics these days.
Robert, I'm seeing you respond. Have you talked to the NDP campaign? Like, are they concerned about the opposition leader, Andrea Horwath, being too negative and not connecting with voters?
No, I think they think she's their greatest strength. She pulls ahead of them, and she is a good campaigner. But I don't know. I have to say, Tim, this is her fourth kick at the can. And if she couldn't win, in 2018, going up against a very unpopular Liberal premier in Kathleen Wynne and a very polarizing Tory leader in Doug Ford, I'm not sure how she does this time. I don't think the Liberals are going to get 19% of the vote on June 2nd, the way that they did in June 2018. So I think she has a big challenge, and Colin is right. She has really been very negative throughout. And I know, as you've been an opposition leader, you know that the job is to oppose, and you have to be negative a lot of the time. But I think on some things on the pandemic, if I were her, I might have said, you know, here's some suggestions that the premier has that the premier has done, and good for him for doing it. We saw that with Del Duca early in the pandemic. Del Duca wrote a long letter to Ford and said, let restaurants sell booze to go, and a couple of things like that. And the Tories did that. Rod Phillips was the finance minister at the time. He gave Stephen Del Duca credit, in part because it gave the Tories political cover in case those were unpopular decisions. It turned out those were popular decisions. Del Duca got some credit, the Tories got some credit, and it looked like they were being constructive actors. And I think Colin's right that the public is looking for people to work together. And one reason why Ford is still in front in the polls, I think, is because he's worked very effectively with Chrystia Freeland, the Deputy Prime Minister, and with Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister, on the pandemic.
All right, let's move on now to the pandemic itself. Then I want to talk housing and how that's going to play out come Election Day. But that was fantastic insight. Right? I have three of you with, I think, the best take on what's happening around Queen's Park and behind the scenes. So thank you for that big picture. Okay, Marika, I'm going to start with you. We are now, mid-February, hopefully continuing the unwinding through the pandemic. To what extent do you think the pandemic is going to be an issue come June? And will any party have how they handle the pandemic as part of the ballot question?
I mean, that's $1 million question, right, Tim? I don't think many of us expected Omicron to come crashing in on Christmas and to really inundate vaccinated people and unvaccinated people. Yes, there are different outcomes. Yes, there's differences in severity, but it just reminds us of how unpredictable this is and how we do not know where this is going in the next few months. That means campaigning, setting up a platform, figuring out what your game plan is that much more difficult and that much more there's much more fog around the game plan into Election Day in Ontario. And I think that will continue. I think that people want to hear hope from their leaders. They want to hear a way out of the pandemic. And so the opposition is going to be needing to be very careful in how they speak about the pandemic. I think that people don't want to hear that they're still in it and we still need to be focused on it. Yes, there needs to be a criticism or a highlighting of the challenges of the Ford government's pandemic response, but people want to look forward. They don't want to spend their time focusing on the last 22, 23 months of a lot of misery in Ontario and the rest of the world.
All right, just to pursue that, Colin, so early in the pandemic management worked very successfully for a number of premiers, re-elected majority governments. Last year, not so hot. So if you are any of the parties, is pandemic management going to be part of your ballot question?
For the NDP, definitely is. I mean, for them, they want to make this about the pandemic because, there have been a lot of families that have been scarred by what's been going on over the last 2 years in Ontario. And so, yes, I mean, the NDP is going to want to make this, really a referendum on how the premier handled COVID-19. But, to Marika's point, the premier is just going to take whatever suggestions are made about, the fact that there wasn't enough PPE at the beginning of the pandemic, or not enough nursing staff, et cetera, and they're just going to, toss that off to the Liberals. So it really does depend on where the mood is, but the NDP is going to make this about the past few years. I don't know necessarily about the Liberals. The Liberals seem to want to turn the page on everything. They really want to move on and talk about the future, talk about building. And definitely the Progressive Conservatives are looking at the future. I mean, Robert Benzie was alluding to this earlier. They are solely focused on where they are going to go next. The Premier has been talking about all of the long-term care homes that they're building and all of the beds that they're creating. He doesn't want to talk about the deaths that happen inside long-term care homes. It's just more of a, how are we fixing the issue that we were presented with? So, yes, the pandemic will be kind of this ballot box issue, but not in the way I think that, the NDP might want it to be. It's not going to be a referendum on the premier because Justin Trudeau ran during the fourth wave, and it didn't really end up being the ballot box question on how he was handling the pandemic. It was just one of the creatures that was alive and well during the pandemic that was impacting the campaign, but it wasn't ultimately the ballot box question.
Okay, Robert Benzie, Toronto Star. So let's say the NDP does try to make that a ballot issue, that the pandemic management was poor. How does that play out for the Ford government then? They benefit as a positive, a negative, or just a wash?
I mean, it's a tricky one because everyone is ornery. Everyone is. Marika talked about the protests in Ottawa. People are, and those are a symptom of a broader malaise, of broader frustration. And I think it would be instructive to look at, we talk about the 1945 election in Britain, where Winston Churchill had won World War II, or at least won the war in Europe, and then voters elected a Labour government, Clement Attlee, before the Japanese had been defeated. I mean, in the middle of the end of the war, even though Churchill was lionized and was very popular. George H.W. Bush in 1992 lost to Bill Clinton, despite winning the Gulf War in 1991 and being very popular. And in both those cases, domestic concerns, the economy, job crisis, those kinds of things were what drove those elections. I don't think that we're in an election like 1945 necessarily, in 1992 in the States. Here in Ontario, but we might be, it might be something that surprises us that comes up. Maybe people are fed up and don't want to talk about the pandemic, but there is something else. Now, luckily, we don't have a slowing economy. We know economic growth is going to be around 4% this year. We know that Ontario has 300,000 jobs that need to be filled. So we don't have a jobs crisis, but I do think that there may be something else out there that we haven't seen yet that takes hold and takes root.
And to come back to that, I'll do that as my final question about the thing we don't see coming, and get your experience to make that prediction. So, Colin DeMello, CTV News, I'm going to start with you on our final segment here, and that's housing and home ownership. And you've talked a lot about this on CTV, how this is not just a Toronto problem; it's now a problem throughout the province. Many people thought, you know what, when I grow up, I can afford a home in the neighborhood that I grew up in, and that's fading away. How do you see housing affordability playing out on the campaign?
Well, I think affordability in general, Tim, is going to be one of the biggest issues of this campaign. I mean, it already is becoming unaffordable to live in cities, unaffordable to rent in cities. Gas prices are at an all-time high. There are these constant questions about, certain generations not being able to ever get into the housing market. And so I think you're going to see a lot of strategies being presented. It will be interesting to see whether or not the PCs will be able to table legislation before the House rises, before the election campaign, to actually say, look, we're trying to get legislation through Queen's Park right now that would make housing more affordable, that would, perhaps build fourplexes or duplexes on the streets instead of single family homes. I think the PCs really like, or the Premier really likes things that are tangible, right? Instead of just talking about things that they're going to do for you, he wants to show people, look at this building that we built, look at this highway that we're building, look at all of these things that, you can actually drive on or touch or feel. And so I think that's what he's going to be focusing on. But, while the Liberals were still waiting on what their housing platform is going to look like, one of the things that the NDP has that's interesting is, giving first-time home buyers or first-time renters money to help them with that down payment. And for a lot of young people who, typically don't necessarily come out to vote, that could galvanize them to come out and stop treating their parents like the bank account and start treating the government like the bank account and trying to capitalize on that. But housing affordability will undoubtedly could be one of the key issues of this campaign.
Our pollster that we used as part of this conference says, Marika Walsh, that housing affordability is a motivator, particularly for millennials and the parents that love them dearly, but wouldn't mind if their son or daughter got out of the basement to a place of their own. So what do you think are going to be the major things first of all, do you agree with that premise? And then what does your gut tell you the major things that will drive those votes? What do they have to put in their platform to attract those voters?
I think this is exactly, Tim, what is actually the focus of so many people right now. Housing affordability factors into this bigger basket of overall cost of living going up. And that is what is really troubling voters, not just in Ontario, but across the country. And so it goes to, again, how these opposition parties and how the governing party decides to talk about what they are proposing. Because if the opposition party gets tripped up and spends the election just picking at the Ford government about their pandemic response and does not put forward and amplify and put a spotlight on their plans to address housing affordability, to address cost of living, then they're going to be leaving voters wanting, because voters want to be moving forward from the pandemic. They don't want to spend more time thinking about the last 23 months. They want to figure out how they will be helped, how it will be made easier or doable for them to live in the cities that they work in rather than driving 2 hours to and from work. And so again, this comes down to focusing on the looking forward, on what they are proposing government will do for them. And again, as I said earlier, that's going to depend on whether we're in another wave of COVID in the middle of this election, or whether it looks more like it's in the rearview mirror and we can be forward looking. But certainly having that housing plan is going to be critical for any party that's hoping to make inroads in the legislature or win government.
So, Rob Benzie, one thing that survived through COVID, a bit of a freezing the market initially, but then housing actually has gone up as a result of COVID.
Yeah.
People looking for a place to call home, safety and security, a bit more space. So, I mean, it's going to continue to rise as an issue. Colin mentioned the New Democrat plan, or some features of it. What are you hearing from about the Conservatives or Liberals? What kind of ideas, policies will they put on the table on these housing affordability voters?
I mean, they want to woo voters for these same reasons, but a lot of things, I mean, there are a lot of factors well beyond the control of any political party. Interest rates are going to rise in March. We know Tiff Macklem at the Bank of Canada has said that, and that's going to jolt the housing market in a different way. The pandemic has changed the housing market, as you well know, Tim. I mean, my wife is from Goderich originally, and my brothers-in-law down there can't tell me how expensive housing has gotten there. There's bidding wars on houses that used to cost $300,000, now they cost $500,000, and that's because a lot of people from the GTA have moved because of the pandemic. They've moved to beautiful Huron County, or they've moved to Halliburton, or they've moved to Muskoka area, and they live there full time, and they do their work like we're doing now over Zoom. And that has led to rising prices across the province. And it's great for the industry on some level, but it's going to be bad down the road, because it means that local folks can't afford houses because they don't earn as much money in some of these areas. And it's like gentrification or something. It has unintended consequences, I think. So I think if you're Doug Ford, you're going to be talking, or Stephen Del Duca, you're going to be talking about housing affordability, and you're going to put some stuff in the window for voters to say, there'll be some tax-free things. Remember, Ernie Eves had the land transfer tax rebates back in the early 2000s. My wife and I took, or actually, it was Mike Harris, actually, the land transfer tax rebate. When the government you were in, Tim, my wife and I took advantage of that when we bought this house, that we were able to get a land transfer rebate because I can't remember what it was. It bought us a coffee table, I think. But when you're starting out, those kinds of things mean a lot. And I think governments will or political parties will be looking at things like that are good kitchen table discussion issues, like, oh, look, we got a break on this, or we got a break on that. But there's only so much they can do if interest rates start to go up.
Yeah, thanks for talking about that first time home buyer rebate, because it's a big focus for us in GR. We did get that increased under the Tories and then under the Liberals and a Kathleen win.
Yeah.
And now we're asking for it to go up to 8,000. It's about 4,000 right now, depending where you are. Okay, my second last question, and then I want to get to the Benzie question at the end, which is what's the dark horse issue that nobody sees coming? But I'm going to turn the cameras on us a little bit. I really respect your experience and your wisdom, and you're going to be my focus group for our audience here. Just like to ask, and I'll start with you, Rob Benzie, on this. How is OREA and the realtors we represent, how are they perceived around Queen's Park circles?
I think I think you guys have influence because you're in every riding, Tim, and you also work with all the parties. So you're not seen as, even though you're the former PC leader, you're not seen as a Tory organization, if you know what I mean. The Liberals worked closely with you. I remember you working with Charles Sousa and Kathleen Wynne on initiatives, because every riding and every community in the province has real estate folks in it. It's an important driver of local economies across the province. So I think they pay a lot of attention to you, to the organization, and because they have to. It's good politics. It's good local politics.
And Colin, any tips for us just from your purchase CTV and how we can do a better job fighting for Ontario homeowners and those that want to own a home?
Well, I mean, in terms of policy shaping, it seems like all the parties want to have that nonpartisan advice, right? Because there's no end in sight to getting that partisan advice, and they know where they can go to get that. But OREA seems to kind of play that middle ground really well, providing that nonpartisan advice, and I think that's really what they're looking for. That's certainly what the government has been looking for, right? They seek out people who aren't going to just tell them what they want to hear, but will actually give them a clear view of how this is going to impact people on the ground, impact people right across the province. And especially when it comes to this kind of housing policy that's going to be very instrumental. There is this divide. People seem to kind of look at developers in a negative view. And so, fighting for the little guy seems to really ultimately get you a little bit more cachet with the politicians, because they're looking to be the party of the little guy as well.
Okay, and Marika Walsh, just advice for us. We have to connect with politicians. Colin Robert talked about that, but also civil servants, good relationships with the media to help get our message out as well. How are we coming across?
Look, you guys are at the center of the biggest issue in Canada right now, not just in Ontario, and that is the housing affordability issue. And I think it's going to play massively in the next election. I think what we've seen from governments federally and across Canada is that getting quick results, getting effective results within a 4-year election cycle on housing is very difficult. The Liberals federally have not been able to make headway on it. And so I think a focus on policies that deliver faster and that voters are able to see a result, not the inverse of a result where we see these skyrocketing prices. I think those are what they're looking for now.
Terrific. We appreciate that objective advice, and particularly from your level of experience and insight. Final wrap-up question. Benzie gave it to me, so I'll give him the last shot at this. Colin DeMello, the Rob Benzie question, the dark horse issue, one that nobody sees coming, faith-based schools, what have you. What's it going to be for 2022?
Oh, this is going to be a really difficult one. I mean, let's just say it'll have something to do with license plates. I don't know. I mean, or how about this one? I mean, ultimately government competency, right? Like maybe that's the dark horse issue. We've seen 4 years in Ontario of just absolute havoc. It's been really great for the media. We've really enjoyed the past 4 years because it's been a roller coaster with endless loops. But do people really want a competent government, or do they want to see Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde on any given day? So maybe competency could finally be an issue that people actually want to see come true during an election campaign.
All right, fair enough. Marika Walsh, you talked property, housing costs, healthcare, pandemic management, all the obvious issues. What's the Marika Walsh curveball here that will surprise voters come June?
I think what I'll say is that in 2018, things like Buck-a-Beer got a lot of attention, played very strongly. And so let's look to which parties are coming up with innovative populist policies that could galvanize the electorate towards them in ways that we don't expect or that we think is immaterial to their daily lives, but still ends up rallying a lot of folks.
All right, final word on this, Robert Benzie, Toronto Star.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a kitchen table affordability issue that perhaps we haven't thought about it. Maybe it's to do with housing, maybe it's to do with gasoline. I don't know. But I have a feeling that the one thing that everyone is talking about right now is inflation, interest rates, things like that. And people are feeling the pinch and wages aren't going up I mean, well, you saw the Ford government raise the minimum wage to $15 as of January 1st after saying that they wouldn't do that. And why did they do that? Because they know that there are so many empty jobs unfilled out there that that businesses are paying more than $15 an hour anyway. So you might as well make it the minimum wage because there's such a shortage of workers. I think it's going to be something like that. It's going to be something to do with wages or something to do with affordability, a kitchen table thing, something that we haven't seen yet.
All right, fantastic. Well, there you have it, folks. The insight from some of the best around Queen's Park journalism. What's going to happen come June the 2nd? How much will housing play a role in pandemic management? Will that impact on the ballot? Plus their dark horse issues. Go make your bed at the water cooler next time you're in the office. You guys are fantastic. Robert Benzie, Colin DeMello, Marika Walsh. We really appreciate you taking the time. Let me say on behalf of the realtors, Andrew Ray, we appreciate the work that you do. It is a tough enough job in the media, particularly in this environment. You've had to do it from a distance, but keep holding government officials and parties to account. So thanks for your outstanding contributions to the public debate today. We'll look forward to seeing you again soon.
Hopefully in person. Thanks, Tim.
Yeah, hopefully in person next year. See you, Marika. See you, Colin. Take care.
All right, that was great. I want to thank very much Marika Walsh, Rob Benzie, Colin DeMello. Awesome job. Folks, coming up next, is he ready to be leader of our province of Ontario? Ontario Liberal leader, Stephen Del Duca.
Ontario Realtors have a plan to save the Canadian dream of home ownership in our province. It includes lowering costs for first-time buyers, ending money laundering in the real estate market, and cutting years of delay from red tape that stand in the way of more affordable homes for our families. Our plan will lay the foundation for a future where all Ontarians can find a place to call home. When we support the dreams of moms and dads who want to own a home, we're building a better province with healthier families, stronger communities, and a safer, more secure future for all Ontarians. You can read our plan at aria.com/affordable homes.
Our next guest is a true champion of home ownership in the province of Ontario. You know Stephen Del Duca. He was a senior cabinet minister in the previous Liberal government, taking on the Ministry of Transportation as well as Economic Development and Trade. He was elected as leader of the Ontario Liberal Party in an exciting convention in March of 2021, although not so exciting. He won in a single ballot vote like that and has been a very strong performer since, focusing on rebuilding the Ontario Liberal Party, reaching out to Ontarians and putting on a Ontario Liberal plan for the future of our great province. I want to tell you, I've had the pleasure of sitting with Leader Del Duca in the legislature. We've had some great conversations in the House and outside of it. And he's always been very committed to home ownership. It goes back to the values he was raised with. It goes back to his time as a leader with the Carpenters Union in the province of Ontario. And I was very impressed too when he launched his campaign for Liberal leader. One of the first issues he talked about was the value of home ownership and helping to spread that about the province of Ontario. And I can tell you, you've had some excellent meetings with Leader Del Duca and his team as they focus on their platform and what it means for housing affordability in the province of Ontario. So we are now just a few short months away from the election campaign, June 2022. I will get to that. First of all, Stephen Del Duca, welcome back to the Ontario Realtor Party Speaker Series.
Well, thanks very much, Tim. I'm so thrilled to be here with you again. Looking forward to the conversation. Always love hearing from Ontario's realtors. And I just want to say to you and your team, you continue to do a phenomenal job for your members and frankly, for our province with the advocacy that you are bringing to bear. So thanks for this opportunity.
Well, very, very kind of you. And again, thank you for the meetings that we've had with you personally and your team on housing issues. But before we get to that, I got to ask you, I'm sorry to start with this hard question here, but what's going on with your Montreal Canadiens? Like, they were the Stanley Cup final last year, almost the bottom of the league this year. Yeah. What's gone wrong with your Habs?
Oh, geez, I don't even know where to begin, Tim. I got to tell you, though, one of the great benefits of being so busy this past year is that I just haven't had much of a chance to watch how abysmal they are. So it's a bit painful. But, can I just say quickly, because I know changing sports, you're a huge Bills fan. I really thought this was going to be the year. So excited to watch them perform. I think they have a bright future with quarterback Allen and the rest of the team, and I'm looking forward to seeing that.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. Still feeling the heartbreak. Actually, Debbie and I and a couple of friends went to Kansas City for that game. Screamed my lungs out. Wow. Put the booster to the test, came back healthy too. It was an awesome game, and I remember that forever.
Very cool.
You mentioned how busy you are. I look back 2014, man, 8 years ago, when I was leader of the PC party. And this time was focused extensively on getting out about the province, connecting with voters, going to every business opening, envelope opening out there, recruiting candidates, letting them hear your vision for the province. That was in the pre-pandemic world. So give us a taste of your experience then. How much more difficult is that to do that we're still kind of in restriction and the world of Zoom?
Well, look, it's certainly different than I planned. Having won the leadership just a few days before the first lockdown in March 2020, I had the chance to tour just a little bit right after the convention, but not nearly to the extent that I was hoping to. And then, of course, thrust all of us, not just me, but not just Liberals, but all Ontarians, thrust into having to contend with such a difficult and disruptive pandemic, especially back in those earliest days when everybody was scrambling. But I look at the work that I do as a political leader. I look at the work of politics. I think there's a lot that we have that's in common with the work that realtors do. I mean, both of our businesses are people kind of businesses, people focused businesses. I think within our party, we've had the success in being able to transition to so much more of our work being done virtually, which is not unlike the work that many of your members have had to do over the past couple of years as well. I've had the chance, the honor to help build a team of candidates that I think is truly exceptional. Women and men from every walk of life who are committed to the same values that I hold dear. And so I've been relying an awful lot on that exceptional roster of candidates to hear about what's taking place in their communities to make sure that the plan that we're going to put forward is a plan that will resonate and be compelling in every corner of this province. So it's not right. It's not exactly what I expected heading into our convention, but I think we've transitioned well. And I think the people of Ontario, despite how tough it's been, are truly, truly resilient. And, we're going to get through this. There's no doubt in my mind.
Well, we appreciate that you joined us last year as the new leader and now heading the campaign. But there's probably some of our 2,000 realtors watching right now who haven't had the chance to hear from you directly. So what kind of message do you want to convey to our audience about what Stephen Del Duca and the Ontario Liberal Party stand for?
Well, I think the most important thing for me to convey is that, look, I came back to politics. I ran for leader of my party. I'm now running to be Ontario's next premier because, look, my wife and I are raising 2 young daughters. Many have heard me talk about my daughters extensively. I think they're a little bit tired of hearing me talk about them, but I love talking about them because our older daughter's in grade 9, our younger daughter's in grade 5. I think back on the life that I've had here. Being born in Ontario, growing up in this province with parents who came from different parts of the world, parents who met here, fell in love, and did everything, like literally sacrificed everything so that my brothers, my sister, and I, that we had every single opportunity. But my parents also enjoyed the benefit of a province and a country that gave them the room to achieve and to prosper because we had publicly funded education that was second to none and a public healthcare system that was there when it was needed. And clean air to breathe and safe water to drink. And I'm very, very concerned that at this moment, given what we've seen over the past now nearly 4 years from Doug Ford and his team, that the opportunity that I had growing up is not necessarily going to be there for my daughters. And so I'm in this fight. I'm running to be premier because I believe we need a responsible and competent premier and team in place at Queen's Park to make sure we have a real, thoughtful, evidence-based plan to get through this pandemic and then to build an economic recovery that works for all of us. So that's why I'm in this race. And really, with the work that we're doing to assemble that team I talked about a second ago and a plan that really is going to be compelling and relatable for people, I think we're on the right track. But my values are the values that were passed to me by my grandparents and by my parents. They're the values my wife and I are trying to give to our daughters about you work hard, you sacrifice, you do what needs to be done, you play by the rules, and you should have every opportunity to succeed.
One of the challenges an opposition leader faces is getting their message out. The microphones come in your face from the media. What do you think about the premier said? You've got pandemic news every day. So let's put that aside for now. If there's 2 or 3 things that you want to be talking about between now and election day, what would they be?
Well, first, one of the things that's been so important to me, and you touched upon this, the traditional role of an opposition leader is just to be critical and just to oppose. But from the very beginning, I've said to my team, we can't just oppose, we have to also propose about where we think the government should be doing better, where we think we need to go as a province. And so that is the work that really has taken up so much of my time, and gladly so, with a lot of the positive suggestions that we've tried to constructively bring forward. I've reached across party lines at Well, I've lost count how many times I've sent letters to the premier. I've reached out to him and Andrea Horvath and Mike Schreiner. I've done my best to try to lead collaboration here. I really, truly believe Ontarians want to see a new kind of political leadership that isn't afraid to collaborate, that isn't afraid to recognize that other parties and other leaders sometimes have good ideas. That shouldn't diminish any of us. It should actually strengthen our entire province. And so, this combined with just keeping our heads down and working as hard as we possibly can, both myself and our team of candidates, to me, and I learned this a long time ago, Tim, there's no shortcut to success. You know this. Your members know this. It's just literally about the relentless hard work, because you're focused on such an important goal, which is to build an economy that truly does support each and every one of us, regardless of where we live, regardless of what our circumstances are. And again, the team that we've assembled is so exciting for me to watch. It's the single greatest turnover and renewal of talent in the Ontario Liberal Party's history. And we are a team that, should we earn the honor of governing Ontario on June 2nd, we're a team that's going to be ready to start the important job of recovery on day one.
No, thanks for that. It's true. It is nice to hear a tone about what you want to propose instead of simply the knee-jerk opposition that often happens in our politics. I love how you talk about your daughters, and our daughters are similar in age. Miller's now in grade 9, Maitland's in grade 2, so slightly younger than your second, but same thing. I wonder, are they going to be able to afford a home someday? And certainly a lot of people older than them that have played by the rules, they've saved up money, they got the degree, they got a good job, maybe they're expecting a family, and they can't find an affordable home to save their lives. I know this is a big issue for you. So I'm going to ask all the leaders this. So in a nutshell, in a sentence, what does Stephen Del Duca think the root cause of the problem is on housing affordability, and what would your solution be?
Well, look, I think, first of all, I do share the great concern. It's frankly, it's more than concern. It's a fear that my wife and I have about where will our daughters go? Where will they live? Whether that's renting or buying or whatever it is, at any stage of their life, how are they going to be able to afford to enjoy any kind of life like we've been able to enjoy? I think we all know that there's a massive supply challenge that we have in Ontario. It started years ago. It's been growing. I think we have a lot of burdens that we put on the approvals process. I think that we, despite the fact that we try to come up with good ideas, and this is all levels of government, I think sometimes we miss the plot because we add additional burdens, because we add additional items or mechanisms that, for the best of intentions, might actually slow down what we need to do. I think we're at the point now where we need to completely forget about nibbling around the edges or just sort of adjusting the margins. I think we have to have a really frank conversation about the kind of bold solutions we're going to need. And some of those conversations, Tim, might need to be a little bit uncomfortable for some of the people that we have and levels of government that we have in the system. I think we all have to recognize every level of government and others have perhaps inadvertently made a tough situation an awful lot worse. So right now, we're continuing to talk to all of our partners, including you, Tim, and your team at OREA and so many others, about the kind of housing plan that will actually work, that will be bold enough to actually work and make life for your kids and my kids a little bit more affordable in the years to come. And I'm looking forward to releasing that plan. But I just want to stress that we are well past the point where we can simply think a few changes here and there is going to be good enough, and we can kick this ball down to the field to the next government to come after or some future generation. The crisis is here. We're in the middle of it right now, and we need to move heaven and earth to fix it.
No, and thank you for involving OREA in the formation of that plan. And we'll offer a ready stage when that plan is to be released about how to help bring affordable home ownership closer to hand, for sure.
Thank you.
And I was thinking back too, while you joined us last year remotely as leader of the Ontario Liberal Party, 2 years ago, you were there live in person at our conference, and we hosted a debate for the then Liberal candidates are running to succeed Kathleen Wynne. And you stood out among the Liberal candidates because you said that you would not allow a land transfer tax outside of the city of Toronto. Deeply appreciate that. Just makes things more unaffordable. Since then, others have suggested we need other taxes like a foreign buyer's tax, a vacancy tax. Where does the Ontario Liberal Party stand on the land transfer tax or any other new taxes on housing?
Right. Well, first of all, I still have very fond memories of that conference, not just the debate and discussion we had as leadership candidates, but my goodness, what an incredible show OREA did organize and put on for your members and for all of us. That was quite incredible. And again, still have fond memories from that. You might recall when I was answering the question that day, and I talked about how, and I want to be clear again, I don't believe the land transfer tax should be extended to any other municipality in this province. I started my comments in response to that question by saying one of the first commandments that we all have to follow if we're going to solve the housing affordability crisis is do no more harm. And, you know, a second ago, I talked about sometimes well-intentioned people in the public policy space or government. We come up with these really what sound sort of in boardrooms or in ivory towers like great solutions, but when they're translated out to the real world, they actually make that tough situation an awful lot worse. So, you know, I am not a fan of doing any additional harm, whether it's intentioned or not, to making this challenge more difficult. So again, want to be completely clear. I don't believe in extending the land transfer tax to any other municipality in the province, but I also want to go a step further. And I want to make it absolutely clear that I do not support and I will oppose with everything I can possibly bring to the discussion, whether it's municipal, provincial, or federal, any conversation that talks about, for example, a surtax on principal homes. Tim, you and I know that this is the concept of home ownership has been so fundamental to Canadian and Ontario values, the families that you and I, well, were raising and the families that we came from. We know that the investment in one's principal residence or their home is so important. It's one of the biggest purchases, if not the very biggest purchase any family is going to make at any point in their life. And so to protect and to preserve that, to me, is fundamental to my vision for the future of this province. And so I just wanted to be crystal clear, no expansion of the land transfer tax and no surtax on principal residences or homes really in this province. It just, to me, makes no sense whatsoever.
No, thanks for the crystal clarity and that strong word on the home equity tax, because we are afraid that some politicians may turn in that direction. You laid out why that would be a bad idea. And that reminded me of an early conversation, you know, that you and I had before you became leader. And that was around your belief in home ownership. You talked a lot about the role your dad played in that. Share with your audience about how that, you know, drives your heart.
Yeah, so for close to, well, his entire working career, my dad came to Canada from Italy in 1958, and he worked in construction management. He did residential of all kinds of construction in the residential sector, some in the ICI sector. He literally worked right up until the age of 79 after arriving here in Canada at the age of 20. And he still says to me, my dad's now 83, he still says when I go to visit that he really wishes he could just find a new project to sink his teeth into and get back to work. And there's something about that incredible ethic that, you know, our parents and our grandparents brought to our province, brought to our economy, brought to our society. That focus on playing by the rules, the sacrifice, the hard work, and that focus on family that kind of go hand in hand and always have. And again, I just want to stress, those are values that I hold so dear, that my wife holds so dear, because her family story, very, very similar to my family story. And at the end of the day, the work that my dad did, you know, he played a part in helping people through many, many decades achieve that dream of home ownership. I know he still talks very, very, in a very fond way about all of the projects that he had the chance to work on throughout the years, whether that was high-rise residential or the low-rise stuff, or any of the projects that he's worked on. When we drive around the GTA, he can see projects that he worked on, and he still talks about them. And that's something I had the honor, in fact, throughout high school and early university to work on some of those projects in my summer months. And it really does give you an incredible sense of how important that work is to make sure every part of our economy and society is giving people that fair shot, that real chance to be successful. And again, right now that's missing in this province. I think it's missing for a bunch of reasons. I want to make sure that's restored. I want to make sure it's improved upon for my kids and for yours as well, Tim.
Yeah, I love that story. Very inspiring. And you can see the pride you have in what your dad taught you. And no doubt your dad's very proud of how his son is doing now. The other question that our audience is interested in is on the offer process. There's a lot of discussion publicly about eliminating the traditional offer process and getting rid of what they call blind bidding and going to an open all your cards on the table system.
Right.
Basically force people to some kind of auction. Here at the Real Estate Association, we say, you know what? A home is such a valuable asset to an individual that she should decide how she wants to sell her home. She should be in the driver's seat and she should choose what option she wants. Where does Stephen Del Duca and the Liberal Party stand on the offer process?
Yeah. So listen, I think that, you know, I said this earlier, I think we're at a point where the crisis is all around us right now. So having a creative conversation about all the tools available to us, I think is important if we're truly going to solve this. But this idea of mandating auctions, or whatever the right terminology is, you know, to me, the most important thing, as I said a second ago, do no more harm, but also, sometimes, Tim, this, politicians just like to say, here's a series of things we're going to do, whether or not those things are connected to actually achieving the outcome, in this case, more affordable housing right across this province. I've said this to you, I think, in the past. I'd want to see the direct link and the direct evidence between any reforms to this process and whether or not that's actually going to help us get to where we want to go. I will tell you right now, the idea of mandating auctions is not something that I'm interested in, but I do want to make sure, working closely with OREA and others, that we arrive in a place where the solutions that we put forward don't just make us feel good as politicians. People are tired of that kind of governing where we're in it just for ourselves. Whatever solutions we come up with together actually have to help solve the problem in a real way. And that's what I would much rather focus on.
I know our audience appreciates those direct answers, Mr. Leader. Thank you for taking on the tough issues. Big picture question, then I'll do a wrap-up question. I'm very appreciative of your time. I know how much demand there is on it. So big picture, let's say Stephen Del Duca comes back to our conference. Love to have you as Premier of the province of Ontario. What major things will you have put on the table? Let's look past the pandemic,
right,
but in terms of the new economy we're seeing, greater uses of technology, a bit of distrust in voters. That what we did see in the pandemic was government can, when it puts its focus to things, get big things done. So what will you be boasting at on our stage if you come back as Premier of the province?
Well, I look forward to that opportunity, and you can bet that I'd be back for sure. And so let me just say, I think one of the things that we've learned during this pandemic is that leadership does matter and experience matters, and having a responsible and competent individual in the Premier's office is really, really important. Having a responsible and competent team on the field is also really, really important to make sure that the challenges that we are going to face, that we face right now, that have really been exposed to us, because COVID really has revealed some of the fundamental challenges that we have in this province. To me, the job of Premier, obviously, you face an awful lot of challenges, but the two twin pillars upon which everything else is built in our province, publicly funded education that is exceptional, that is resilient, and universal public health care that, again, is also exceptional and resilient. And I keep using the word resilient because I think that we've learned during this pandemic that despite the multi-billions of hard-earned tax dollars that we collectively invest in these systems, that there are cracks. There are cracks that have been kind of exposed over the past couple of years. The systems have not been resilient enough. Watching the ICUs fill up at various points during the pandemic and realizing that in a province of 15 million people, that when you get to 700 or 800 ICU beds, that the system suddenly is kind of crumbling. To me, that's not good enough. We need to figure out how we can support our frontline doctors and nurses, how we can make sure people get exceptional care close to home, and that we're able to transition through future crises without having to say we're going to delay 8,000 to 10,000 essential surgeries every single week. And similarly in schools, I mean, I watched with a breaking heart as my daughters were in that whiplash back and forth, schools opening and closing. I know it was tough for families and for kids right across this province. Learning, both for our economy and for our society, is essential, and it cannot be interrupted. So we need to make sure that we are supporting frontline workers, our teachers, making sure our schools are in a state of good repair, making sure kids with special needs and mental health challenges get the support they need. If those two twin pillars are functioning the way that we deserve them, we deserve to have them functioning in this province, Tim, I think everything else, including our economy, flows from there. I just really want to point out one last thing on the economic recovery.
Sure.
We need to make the right kinds of investments. We have a good track record in Ontario of being able to produce prosperity, and those top line economic numbers looking really good. And that's important. We support entrepreneurs. We support our small business leaders. But when we create prosperity in Ontario, it has to be broadly and fairly shared. Everyone has to have that shot, regardless of when they got here, regardless of what part of the province they live in. To me, an economy that works for all of us is essential to our future success and to once again uniting the people of Ontario, which I'm very, very keen to have the honor to do.
Well, thank you for that. Final question for you. So you told a very heartwarming story about your dad. You care deeply about your daughters. You talked about what you hope for them. The realtors watching today love politics. They're very active in their communities, not only helping out clients. You're a great role model in that. You went from the Carpenters Union now to leader of the Liberal Party of Ontario, perhaps our next premier. So what would you say to those watching today who are interested in getting involved in public life?
Oh, look, I think that's a phenomenal thing to do. And I know there are realtors across the province that have stepped up in the past, and I'm sure will again in the future, to play that role, that important role of advocating and perhaps supporting people running for office themselves. I think it's really great. You know, again, a lesson that I think we've all learned during the pandemic is that public service is critically important, that government, when it works with all partners, when it collaborates, can actually be harnessed to deliver some really phenomenal outcomes. Realtors already play an exceptionally important role in our communities. My home community of Woodbridge, communities right across the province of Ontario, an essential part of our economy is also contributed to by realtors. But stepping up to play that role in shaping public policy is so rewarding. And so I would urge your members, yes, obviously vote come this spring's election, but get involved, continue to make your voices heard. I know it's been a really tough past couple of years, but we are a resilient people here in Ontario, and working together, we're not only going to get through this crisis, we're going to build a recovery that's going to be second to none.
Ontario Liberal leader Stephen Del Duca, thanks for those inspiring closing comments, and thank you again for joining us the third year in a row at a Realtor Party conference, and all the best in the campaign trail ahead.
My pleasure. Thanks so much, Tim, and you take care.
My pleasure. Good to hear from Ontario Liberal Stephen Del Duca. All right, next, fasten your seatbelts. The Premier of the province of Ontario himself, the Honourable Doug Ford, coming up right after this.
Leadership is more important than ever. We all know that for too many people in Ontario, life can be tough, especially in the GTA. It's been challenging for families to live affordably. For years, it's been too hard for families to find nice, affordable place to live. It's too difficult and too expensive to find a home right across Ontario. The number of homes that are available to rent or to buy hasn't kept up with the demand, and prices are often just too high. Those days are done, they're gone, things are going to change, and help is here. Our government promised we would remove the barriers to home ownership. Making sure people have a place to call home is good for towns and cities and good for the economy. We're ready to do what we can to help you, to help people find a nice place to call home, a nice place that they can afford, because people deserve nothing less.
Man, I love that video. I remember that day in 2018, still puts chills down my spine. Premier Ford, the first premier, by the way, to ever appear at our Realtor Party conferences, and now back, not for the second, not for the third, fourth straight year. I'm very pleased. Welcome back, Premier Doug Ford. Of course, you know him. He became leader of the Ontario PC Party in 2018. A few months later was in a general election and brought the Conservatives into a majority government. His main goal, get our economy back on track, control government spending, and invest in our future. He's on that path for sure. And then managing through what has been the most demanding health and economic crisis that our province has ever seen. And importantly to us watching at home today, the words he spoke about in 2018, he walked the walk. He has delivered with new legislation, the Trust and Real Estate Services Act, that raised standards to the highest in North America when it comes to professionalism and discipline. He brought in personal real estate corporations, so our realtor members, over 10,000 have taken advantage of that. to invest back in their businesses and hire more people, and also has focused on housing affordability and increasing supply, including a housing affordability task force, of which I have the honor to be one of the members serving. Premier Doug Ford, welcome back to our Ontario Election 22 preview.
Well, thanks so much, Tim, and it's great to be back. And I'm looking at that video. I'm thinking, who would have ever guessed we'd be going through what we went through? And I probably look a few years younger than now. But it's great to be here. And I just want to say before we begin, Tim, I want to thank you personally for all the work that you've done at OREA, and a special thank you to all the realtors you represent for their professionalism and dedication through these challenging times. And I know for a lot of people, a home is the most expensive and important asset they'll ever invest in. They depend on the realtor to support them. And I remember my first realtor when Carla and I met the lady 30 some odd years ago. Boy, that's a long time. And I know day in and day out, Ontario's realtors are there for Ontario's home buyers and sellers to represent them. And they're the greatest group anywhere in North America. They really are. They're all champions.
Well, Premier, appreciate you saying that. You've been very kind. I said thank you for walking the walk as well from what you committed to back in 2018. And we're going to talk a bit about the pandemic. We'll talk about housing affordability and, of course, the campaign coming up in June. But most importantly, how are Carla and the girls doing?
They're doing okay. Everyone can't wait to get out of this whole situation we're in and get the freedoms back and so on and so forth. But they're doing well, and thank you for asking. And I'm sure your family's doing okay.
Yeah, thanks for asking about that. Girls are doing great. Deb's doing well. Miller's in high school now, grade 9. That's kind of,
I can't believe
a
that.
bit of a shocker to me.
Oh my goodness.
I know, but she went to an all-girls school because the boys were too crazy. So that's okay for now. I'm getting, So you mentioned about the girls and the family, and they do keep us grounded. They keep us focused on reality. And I have to ask you, we appreciate your strong leadership through the pandemic. I cannot imagine the weight on your shoulders. And ultimately, leadership is a very lonely position. You have your advisors that say one thing, you have advisors that say the other. You hear from your cabinet, your caucus, and the people, and then you've got to make the call. So help me understand, how do you make that call? What do you do when you've got to make those most difficult decisions, and how do you deal with that kind of pressure?
Well, first of all, Tim, I never forget what a privilege is for myself or any premier to serve as premier of their province, and I'm just very grateful for the support we've had over the last close to 4 years. And especially through the difficult times. And I know people will depend on the leader of the day, the premier of the day, and depend on their government. But in return, I always say, man, I depended on the people of Ontario. So many people, no matter if it's the frontline healthcare workers or the grocery store clerks, and yes, the truckers as well, and everyone else out there that really pitched in. I said it was like, the Ontario spirit, Team Ontario, and there's no one person that could have got us through this. So I just want to thank the people of Ontario, and especially the realtors. That didn't stop throughout the pandemic. People were still buying homes, selling homes, and they stepped up. They stepped up in a massive way. So I'm grateful for that.
And we appreciate the trust you put in realtors and the real estate associations to maintain high standards and maintain an essential service so people could do that, Premier. So thank you. I got to ask you too, I'm feeling good. I feel like we're getting through it, knock on wood.
Are we ever?
God knows how many curveballs are thrown your way during this crisis. Looking back over the pandemic, what was the toughest call you had to make? And is there anything, if you had a chance, that you would have a redo?
Well, I'll tell you, there was a lot of challenging things that we had to face as a province, but right from the get-go, I'll never forget President Trump cut us off on the 3M N95 masks, and we were relying on countries all over the world to get us PPE. And I thought, never again are we going to rely on any country. We're never going to rely on any leader. We have the ingenuity. We have the smartest people, the brightest people right here in Ontario. And within a couple months, I'll never forget, Tim, I went to a press conference and I gave a shout out for help. I said, we need your help. and we set up a portal. Within 2 days, we had 26,000 companies go on the portal. And within a few months, we had stood up people manufacturing a whole PPE, a whole sector actually. People were manufacturing 3-ply surgical masks. We ended up getting 3M. That was probably our biggest accomplishment to open up here in Ontario, in Brockville, and they're pumping out the masks as we speak right now, so we don't have to rely on anyone. We had the distilleries changing over to hand sanitizer. We had clothing manufacturers changing over to produce smocks, and we had manufacturers that produce ventilators. And so that was just critical. So as we stand now, we'll never have to rely on anyone that hold us hostage, because we found out real quick when a crisis hits the world, it's every country for themselves. I found out that real quickly. So, but we stuck together as a country. I'll never forget Alberta sending us a truckload of ventilators, and vice versa. We were sending nurses, and everyone was pitching in. Greatest country in the world, greatest province anywhere, right here in Ontario.
Premier, we're 112 days out from the election on June 2nd. That is going to race by. When you see yourself in the campaign trail, what are the top 2 or 3 things you'll bring back to the people to say, here's what Doug Ford and the government have accomplished for you?
Well, I always look at the economy. It's absolutely critical. That's obviously tied into housing too. Now, we really built a strong foundation for an amazing economy. I always say, as we get through this is going to be like the Roaring 20s. I'm a strong believer in building infrastructure, and we put $145 billion into building roads and bridges and highways. We're going to be building the 413, the Bradford bypass, Highway 3, right across the province. We're building, and that is absolutely critical. We've created an environment for companies to come here and thrive and prosper and grow. And I always say, Tim, when companies thrive, prosper, and grow, so do the people. It's an employee's market. Our biggest challenge right now, everywhere I go in Ontario, there's a sign in people's window, help wanted. And we need more people. So to put this into perspective, when we took over office in 2018, the economy and the jobs were leaving Ontario in the droves. We had lost 300,000 jobs because at the time, the previous government, they just weren't competitive, no matter if it was high hydro rates or red tape and regulations. There's no company that wanted to come here. And within 18 months, we had created 307,000 new jobs, creating that environment. Every day, my Minister of Economic Development, Vic Fideli, sends me a list over of new companies coming here by the droves. Again, I called him the other night and I said, Vic, you better get on the plane, a cargo plane, start loading people up around the world and bring them here, because we need skilled and unskilled workers to come here and help us out. Our economy is strong. It's going to be booming, and I just can't wait. I really, really can't wait.
Those days will race by.
Yeah,
I mentioned that video at the beginning and how it impacts on me, because not only was it the first time we had a premier at our conference, but importantly, I really liked how you connected on the values of home ownership, what it does to people, how it drives them as human beings. And when you watch a politician, you can tell when they're reading a script or when it's hitting them in the gut. I've had the pleasure of being in your parents' home in the past. I know you care deeply about this issue. Like, what is it about home ownership that motivates Doug Ford as a man?
Well, nothing's better than ownership. People take care of their house or their condo if they have ownership. And I remember it was 33 years ago. I'm trying to think how many years I've been married. Thank goodness Carla's not listening to this. But so 33 years ago, Carla and I, we were a young couple, and I remember at the time we thought, boy, it's so tough to buy a home in Toronto. And my dad, he was tight as skin on a grape. You knew my dad, and he said, his exact words to all his kids: "No one gave me anything. I'm not giving you. You go work your back off, and find a place." So Carl and I went out to Brampton, and that was before the 410 was there, and we found a place on Lisa Street, 8 Lisa Street, apartment 2802. I remember like it was yesterday. And we spent $150,000. And back then, for a young couple, I'm thinking, boy, that's expensive. And then 5 years later, it crashed. And we moved and we sold it for $100,000. And then we bought in Etobicoke for $228,000, a beautiful little bungalow in central Etobicoke with a pool. And you're thinking that home I drove by the other day is probably close to $1 million now. But at the time, 228,000, you're thinking, again, a young couple, how are you going to afford it? But we worked hard and thank goodness I have an incredible wife and raised the kids as I was building our facility in the US. And so I just want to do everything I can to give that opportunity that we had to other couples. And it's something, it's no longer, Tim, is it young people? It's everyone is finding it a challenge to buy these homes. And it really comes down, well, I guess we'll get into this, but really supply and demand and cutting the red tape.
Perfect. All right, let's talk about it more, right? I mean, your daughters are in the 20s, thereabouts, right? They're in that age group, but you said it's impacting on everybody across the spectrum. And it's not just a big city, it's the small towns too. So could you, Premier, I'd say in one sentence, describe what you think the core of the problem is, and then in another sentence, what's got to be done?
So I go back to supply and demand and cutting red tape. I'm a big believer of something called Lean Six Sigma, lean methodologies that we introduced in our Chicago facility and our other facilities. It's just driving the process, cutting the red tape. I walked a mile in the municipality shoes with Rob down there. And by no means, I just want to go on record, my pointing the finger at municipalities is truly a 3-level government that can pitch in. But some of the nonsense and red tape to get a permit it's ridiculous. But we have to drive process and make sure we standardize the process. I know one size doesn't fit all when it comes to making sure we have home ownership for everyone. But in saying that, we can make it a lot easier to get shovels in the ground. Time is money. If someone buys a condo and they have to wait 5 to 6 years by the time it gets built, number one, the price goes up. And which drives me absolutely crazy, zero tolerance for, is these developers that take your money and you can borrow off your friends, your family, your mom and dad, and you save up money and you put your deposit down, and 2 or 3 years later the market takes off and these developers hand back the check and said, too bad, too sad, here you go. That is ridiculous. That we're putting an end to make sure when you put your money down, it's up to the developer. It's no different than any other business. If the prices go up, then they should account for that. But we want to make sure that we increase the supply. We want to make sure we give the tools to the municipalities and get support from the federal government as well to make it easier. Number one, to cut through the red tape and standardize and make sure they have building permits in a timely fashion that someone can actually track where their permit is. I used to call the carousel, would just go around. You put your comments in and it would go around and around and you never get an answer. So we're streamlining it. We had a great meeting with municipalities and we're going to make sure we increase the supply.
Well, just months after you made that commitment, we showed the video earlier on, you brought in the More Homes, More Choices Act. It has made a difference. We loved it too, because 10 of the things we suggested, you put in the legislation, and Minister Steve Clark's done a phenomenal job in carrying through on that. We appreciate his work and leadership. And it paid off, right? You had the biggest increase in housing supply in over 2 decades in the last year and 2 years.
That's right.
The question is, we still got a ways to go. So what do you see coming down the track next when it comes to increasing housing supply and choice?
Well, you're right. First of all, Minister Clark's done an incredible job. And since we passed that bill in 2021, we saw 100,000 housing starts. That's more than we've ever seen in 30 years. And then another 14,000 rental units being built, which is absolutely critical. Since 1987, we've never seen that. But it goes back to what I was saying earlier, Tim, is making sure that we work with the municipalities, give them the tools that they need to put in their toolbox to cut the red tape, get shovels in the ground, and get things moving along as quickly as possible. But the most important thing is assuring that we get these permits out the door as quickly as possible, and working collaboratively with the federal and the municipal governments.
I think a lot of our members too, and I like what you said about protecting those consumers who get ripped off by developers that move off with the checks and they lose their chance to get a home. And you've brought in high standards for realtors. We'd love to see the same thing, builders. So we can help in any way. We'll be there at your side, Premier.
Yeah, the party's over for those guys who do that. That's it.
Glad to hear it.
Yeah,
good to hear it. So the other, some others say a different solution than you did. You're saying a supply. Others say we should put more taxes on homes. The way to affordability is to increase the land transfer tax, expand that outside of the city of Toronto, tax on foreign buyers, tax on vacant homes. Can we truly tax our way to affordability? Where does the PC party stand on extending the land transfer tax out of Toronto or other home equity taxes?
Well, I think that's the worst thing we could ever do, Tim, is continue taxing people. You take money out of people's pockets. They aren't going to go out there and spend like they usually would spend. I'm a strong believer that people are a lot smarter with their money than the government. Matter of fact, the worst place anywhere you could give your money is to the government. I don't care if it's municipal, provincial, or federal. If you can avoid giving money to the government, because they waste it. It's very simple. I'd rather put money into people's pockets, and they're going to be able to go out there and save and maybe put an addition onto their home or buy new furniture, stimulate the economy. And that's exactly what we did when we came into office. The media was saying, well, you need to raise taxes. I said, that's the worst thing you could do. So we did the opposite. We didn't raise taxes. We reduced taxes, put more money into people's pockets. And we saw an increase of over $2 billion up to the provincial coffers because there was more people working, more companies opening up, and they were paying taxes. So, if you ever hear the knock on the door, as Ronald Reagan said, and I'm here, the government here to help you, just run out the back door or put an extra bolt on your door. But we're going to do everything we can to make sure that we have the economy going, more money into people's pockets. That is absolutely critical.
One other solution that was put on the table was by Prime Minister Trudeau. He said that we should get rid of the traditional offer process, some call blind bidding, and basically we move to auctions. And at OREA, we say, you know what? The homeowner should be in the driver's seat. She should decide if she wants to use an auction, the traditional offer process, sell it to a family member. Just give them that choice. Where's the PC government stand on that? Do you think the government should tell people how they sell their homes?
Well, I always support the homeowners, and I also support good, fair competition, but I'm not in favor of adding new regulations, new red tape, new bureaucracy. That just gets in the way. There are clear penalties in place for bad actors, and we're going to hold them accountable as sure as I'm speaking to you.
Been big improvements in that to make sure we've got tougher discipline, and we agree people who break the rules should be tossed out of the profession altogether, no questions asked. Thank you, Premier. All right, let's move from housing to the big picture on the economy. It has changed a lot. We've got the work from home. There's a lot of suspicion of authority as a result of the pandemic. During the pandemic, government demonstrated, but it can do big things like the mass vaccination of the population. So how do you see the future economy once we get through this pandemic? And what do you want to see get done?
Well, first of all, we need more support for labor. We need to make sure we have the skilled workers, and we're pouring money into skilled worker programs across our province. We need to invest, as I said earlier on, into infrastructure, which we're doing. We're setting records, $145 billion. I'm a big believer in transit. We have a $29 billion transit project, the largest in North America. Strong believer in TOCs, transit-oriented communities. So we increase density around the subway stations. The developer helps build those subway stations. That is absolutely critical. And again, building roads, getting people from point A to point B, from work to home in a much faster fashion. You get stuck on the 400 series highways. And it could take literally an hour additional to get home, an hour to get to work. You add that up throughout the month, that's almost a week's work 40 hours it will take you. That's why we have to build highways, 413, a Bradford bypass. We have to make sure that we be creative when it comes to the other 400 series highways and get commerce getting from point A to point B as well. So we're big on to getting things done. We say promises made, promises kept, and we're going to keep our promises on building infrastructure, no matter if it's hospitals or schools and roads and bridges.
Thanks for that look ahead. Okay, last question, last word for the Premier. You were very kind off the top to recognize the work realtors did during the pandemic to help people find a great place to call home while keeping them safe with high levels of protection. People watching today love the intersection of politics and real estate. So those that like public life, any advice from the Premier about how they can get involved in the political process?
I encourage everyone to get in the political process. That's how our family started. I got to tell you a quick story. So my dad, a business person, he was getting into retirement. We were getting older, and we were kind of saying, "Okay, Dad, you go home, go down to Florida with Mom." But that was the time when Bob Ray got elected. And he used to sit there at home with my mom and shout and scream at the television when Bob Ray was on, calling them a socialist, a communist, the NDP, the world's coming to an end. And I came home one day and I said, Dad, rather than sit here and complain, I just put your name in the hat to run for a Tobico Humber at the time, I think it was called. And he says, I'm not going to be a damn politician. He goes, I can't stand politicians. I'm not going to become a politician. And sure enough, we had the class of 95 that you were part of, class of 95 coming in. And what a great team you had back then with the great leadership of Mike Harris. My dad was fortunate enough to knock off a 16-year incumbent. Yeah. He was down there. And something, it was probably one of the best decisions he had ever made, next to marrying my mother. And you really get involved. So for the people listening, please get involved in the campaign. Go out there. You can make a difference. If you work on a campaign, a local campaign, you can make a difference on what party gets in and how we drive the economy for the next 4 years. Now, when you're picking a party, I prefer you pick the PC party, but any party, get involved and you'll have a strong voice at the table. And the other thing is the amount of people, and Tim, you know this better than anyone, the amount of people you meet in politics. When my dad ran back in 95, I have still very strong friendships, yourself included, very strong friendships for all these years. And, it's about relationship building in business. And I just encourage you, you meet a ton of people, and in the real estate business, it's all about meeting people and one person referring you to another. So I encourage you, get in touch with your party and please get out there and help out.
Premier, thank you. It's very inspiring final words, and love the story about your dad. He had a spine of iron and a heart of gold. It was an honor to serve with him, and I know he's watching from above. Very proud of what his son is doing on behalf of the province of Ontario. Premier Doug Ford, thank you for your leadership during this pandemic, and thank you for appearing with us today. All the best, the campaign trail ahead.
Tim, thank you, and God bless the realtors of this province, and to you and your family as well. And we'll get through this. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Premier.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, that's episode 1 of OREA's 2022 Ontario election preview show. It's in the books. I think it's safe to say that you're unlikely to find this level of content anywhere else.
That was a great show. It was fun to do it with you, Brian, and it's just the first of 2. So, folks, be sure to tune in come Thursday, the February 17th at 10 a.m. We say we are the best public affairs conference in all of Canada. I think we walked the walk today. Tune in on the 17th to see what's going to happen next time. All right, Brian, what are you most excited about for episode 2 of the 2022 Ontario General Election preview?
Well, I'm looking forward to it, Tim. Episode 2 will feature interviews with MPP Mike Schreiner, leader of Ontario's Green Party, Andrea Horvath, leader of the Ontario NDP, and we'll also have an exclusive broadcast of Canada's most popular political podcast, The Curse of Politics. I can't wait.
Oh, that's going to be good for sure. And get this, I get to interview the Ragin' Cajun himself, the legendary James Carville, the man who took Bill Clinton to the White House. I'm excited about that. I hope you are too. he said some interesting things, been critical of President Biden and the Democrats today. So find out why he said that. I'll get his take on real estate and realtors, and also on Canada-US relations. Be sure to tune in to that. I want to thank very much, well, all of you for tuning in. David Cluttle from Abacus Polling. I want to thank Rob Benzie, Toronto Star, Marika Walsh from the Globe and Mail, and Colin DeMello from CTV News. I want to thank Ontario Liberal leader Stephen Del Duca, and of course, Premier Doug Ford for being part of our show today. Brian Santos, awesome job at co-host. I'm looking forward to seeing you and the rest of the gang Thursday, February 17th at 10 a.m. See you then.